Welcome to Going Antiviral, the podcast for the IAS-USA, a professional continuing medical education organization focused on HIV and other viral diseases. I'm Dr. Michael Saag, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and volunteer member of the IAS-USA Board of Directors. Today, June 13, 2025, we are speaking to Dr. Maldonado, a professor in the Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Maldonado has achieved national and international recognition for her scholarship in the epidemiology and control of infectious diseases. Her research addresses the prevalence, transmission, and progression of HIV and vaccine-preventable diseases in infants and children. She has served on several national and international committees in the area of pediatrics, vaccines, and infectious diseases, including, until this past week, the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or the ACIP. She has also published over 300 peer-reviewed manuscripts and is co-editor of 2 books. Today, Dr. Maldonado joins us to discuss the RSV vaccine, who should get it and why, as well as a discussion of the ACIP. Bonnie, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's really great to see you again.
It's great to see you. And let's start with RSV. Let's go to the basics. What is it? What kind of disease does it cause in both adults and in children?
So RSV is used to be thought of primarily as a pediatric virus. It is a small virus that affects most children, almost the entire birth cohort by the age of 2. So with that degree of penetrance into that population, we do see it as currently the most common cause of hospitalization in children in the United States every single year. So up to 2% of all children in the U.S. under the age of 5 will be hospitalized from RSV infection, primarily respiratory hospitalizations, although dehydration and secondary pneumonia can occur as well. And one of the interesting things about our fields is that we demonstrate that if we don't think about a particular pathogen, we're really leaving ourselves open to additional diseases and threats, because most people thought for decades that RSV was a child disease. And so nobody tested for it, primarily because there wasn't a treatment or a cure or a prevention. And so more recent studies in the last several years really pointed to RSV surveillance in all age groups. And we found that, lo and behold, adults actually have a higher burden of disease, much higher burden of disease, and actually a high death rate and hospitalization rate, almost as significant as that of influenza in adults. So that was very striking. The other interesting thing about RSV is that we have tried for decades, since the 60s, to develop vaccines, but the vaccines were actually not well formulated because we didn't understand the virology of the virus. And they actually not only were not efficacious, but actually overtly efficacious, in the sense that in babies, young infants, exposure to the wild type RSV led to, in some cases, an overstimulation of the immune response. So some children actually had severe immune responses, and there were some deaths. This was in the 60s. So people have been tiptoeing around vaccine development. Now, in the last several years, our colleagues at NIH at the Vaccine Research Center developed an understanding of the fusion protein of RSV. So there's a protein that attaches to the human epithelial cell. We were using the wrong version of that fusion protein, so that we were using the version of the fusion protein, the conformation that exists after the virus fuses to the human epithelial cell. And it turns out that has very poor neutralizing capacity. The high neutralizing capacity exists in the pre-fusion state, which unfortunately, when you isolate that protein, is very unstable. And so it took a long time to really understand all of that, to really stabilize that pre-fusion protein and allow that to be administered as a vaccine. And lo and behold, it is highly efficacious in preventing serious RSV infection. It's decent at preventing infection, but it's incredibly good to the tune of 70% plus effectiveness in preventing serious disease and hospitalization and death. And so this has been a remarkable achievement in the last few years.
Yeah, so I'm glad you went over all that because one of the questions was, well, why are we even focused on adults? And you've talked about that. The vaccine has been approved in adults. It hasn't yet been approved in children. Is that because the studies haven't progressed as far and as fast as the adult population?
Yeah, so that has to do with, again, the approval process. And I remember we talked about the fact that the early versions of the vaccine were really harmful in children in the 60s. And so, what has been approved are vaccines, a number of vaccines now for adults. And the indication there is for adults for sure, 75 and older, and for those 60 to 74 who have underlying conditions that can put them at risk for serious complications, primarily respiratory complications. And also for maternal use for pregnant people between 32 and 36 weeks gestational age for the protection of their infants, because that antibody that's generated in the pregnant person will be transmitted as placentally transferred passive antibody and can protect an infant at the 70% plus rate for up to 6 months and maybe even longer, but at least for 6 months after birth. And knowing that the under 6 month old is the highest risk for serious infection in that younger age group, it's really protective. Now, there are currently trials ongoing for the protection of infants, children 2 years and over. So those trials are going on now. And we do hope to see a safe and effective RSV vaccine for children 2 and over, because what we know is that children of all ages, especially those under 5, will get RSV. And if you're protecting that young baby, we don't really know what will happen to that young baby after that immunity wears off, that passive immunity wears off. So will there be additional infections? And I would say that the answer will be yes, because we all get RSV every single year, all of us. Very short lived immunity. So the question then is, will those 2-year-olds and above actually have serious infection if they're not vaccinated, or will it be a mild cold? And we don't know the answer to that, although we can take a lesson from the post-pandemic period when we had a surge in 2023 of massive surge around the country of RSV infections in all age groups, but particularly the young children under 5. And these were kids who probably hadn't been exposed to RSV during the shutdown of the pandemic. And all of the kids affected were many of the kids were under 5 and were not just infants, but children 2, 3, 4, and 5 years of age.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned that because the incidence of serious RSV disease went down during the COVID epidemic. I suspect because we were in isolation, more wearing masks, whatever. But as you pointed out, once we integrated into sort of everyday activities, then we had this spike. One of the questions that comes up just listening to your description just now is um, if the immunity from natural infection wanes quickly, why is it that, for example, in adults, the vaccine can be protective for more than a year, into several years? What's the science behind that?
Yeah, we don't really understand exactly all of the dynamics here, but we do know that RSV tends to cycle in 3 to 4 year peaks and troughs. And so there may be some degree of incomplete immunity that exists for a period of a year or two or more. But we do know that probably doesn't last more than 3 to 4 years. So there is some hope that there may be some protection for a longer period of time. And I might add that the other issue that comes up is, why don't younger adults or older children get serious infection? Part of it has to do with the physiology, the pathophysiology of RSV. So RSV actually stimulates an intense inflammatory response in the airways, and it also denudes the respiratory epithelium. And if you've ever seen electron micrographs, it is like a burned down forest. And those cilia have to take some time to regenerate. In the meantime, you can see bacterial commensals invading the airspace. But the other reason is that infants have very small airways. And so with the inflammation, you do have literally a physical obstacle to breathing. So you have a ball valve effect where children can breathe in, but they can't really breathe out very well. And so you wind up with pretty serious lower respiratory disease, whereas older children and adults have larger bronchioles and are probably going to have an infection that feels like a bad cold, perhaps, but not necessarily one that will lead them to become hypoxemic or hypoxic.
Does that ball valve situation, especially in the infants, lead to pneumothorax and that type of thing?
Well, I mean, only in really severe situations that I've seen that happen. I mean, I used to see a lot of RSV in my practice. I mean, we used to just line the kids up. And honestly, the other thing that I like to show in my presentations is that despite all of the recommended therapeutics and measures, and none of them really work. So you can try bronchodilators, you can try steroids, oxygen. Oxygen does obviously palliate, but the others really are not effective because, again, this is an intense local inflammatory response that doesn't really seem to respond to any of those methods. But in kids, where I've seen this most serious infections are in hospital acquired RSV, when children have come in and they're already premature babies. Remember, this is a children. I don't know much about adults because we haven't really tested a lot of adults or have case series about adults. But in kids, if they already have underlying disease, for example, if they were premature and had bronchopulmonary dysplasia or had other pulmonary underlying disease, those are the kids that an RSV infection will really push them over the edge. And I've seen those kids then get secondary E. coli or Pseudomonas pneumonia is really severe. And those children many of them have not survived or have had serious complications. And those kids, you might see pneumothoraces. But generally, for the healthy kid, you don't really see that as much.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you can have upper respiratory symptoms as well as lower. It's the lower that really causes most of the morbidity and mortality. Um, I'm pretty sure I had a case of RSV years ago that started off as what seemed like a cold, but the cough lasted for weeks and not much I could do except just wait it out, maybe some bronchodilators. So it's significant,
Yep.
it's significant illness. So let's segue a little bit now to how vaccines get to us. I'm really glad you went over the example of how RSV in its initial iterations as a vaccine really caused problems. And the science, the approach to clinical trials identified that. And the scientific community responded appropriately, said, nope, this isn't going to work. Let's go back to the drawing board, learn more about how the virus caused disease, came up with this notion about the peptide that you described and isolating it and then creating a very effective vaccine now used in adults, maybe kids soon. But that whole process of trials, rigorous follow up of everyone who had a vaccine, all those data go to the FDA. They leads to, if it's effective and safe, approval by the FDA, and then it historically had gone to this CDC committee we talked about, the ACIP, and you were on that committee. Tell us a little bit about how that committee operates.
Yeah, great question. So I would say up until recently, I can testify that uh, we have the most rigorous process, I would say, in the world to review vaccines and other biologics. The FDA and the CDC in particular have done an amazing job over many years, decades, in really overseeing the manufacture, the production, and the testing of biologics, including vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, for example. And first, we have the first step is really the FDA, and they really do a rigorous approach to working with companies to make sure that the products have been tested appropriately, that there are good controlled studies, and they will come out with their own recommendations. And we at the CDC and the ACIP work together as well to then provide clinical guidance for the FDA recommendations. So I would say that these two go hand in hand. So the FDA has an advisory committee that's similar to ours called VRBPAC, or the Vaccines and Related Biologics Advisory Committee. And that committee advises the FDA on the testing of the products that can lead to licensure. So licensure, as you know, means that people can use these products however they would like if they have a license to practice medicine. But we need a lot more detailed guidance. For example, dosing. What if you miss a dose? What if you're off by a few months on a dose? What's the dosage level for different age groups? And all of that the FDA tries to provide at a high level. But you really need that very frontline guidance for people who are providing vaccines to millions of people around the country. And so once the vaccine is licensed by the FDA, according to the 20th Century Cures Act, the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is an advisory committee only to the CDC. That is, they don't make the regulations, they advise on them, very similar to what VRBPAC does for FDA. They must review vaccines within a short time frame that have just recently been licensed. So this is actually a federal mandate that vaccines must be reviewed once they're approved by the FDA, by the CDC. And so the ACIP then takes these vaccines. And by the way, it's not done in a vacuum. We have work, CDC and ACIP work with FDA to see what's in the pipeline. So we set up work groups, and there are several work groups for a variety of different diseases. And for some, there are vaccines, and for others, there may be vaccines in the pipeline. And we start to look at the epidemiology, the prevalence in the population, the vaccines that are available, there are other therapeutics. We really run the whole gamut, and we spend years sometimes reviewing different pathogens and these vaccines with the anticipation that they may be licensed, because you don't want to get a license and then just turn around and say, oh, look, here's a new vaccine. Let's learn everything we need to know about it. We spend years going over vaccine pathogens and then vaccines related to them, so that when the vaccine is licensed, we already have data from the FDA and our own data that we've been collecting and reviewing through the ACIP work groups, so that we understand what the issues are with each of the pathogens, and then know what the vaccine looks like, what's the safety profile like. And we have many times not had vaccines see the light of day. So the fact that people say every time you see a vaccine come to ACIP, it gets approved, they have not seen all of the products that have not made it to that process. By the time they get to ACIP, they have been so highly vetted that you could probably put a list together of all of the different products that have not made it that far. And I think that's part of the issue, is ACIP has worked very silently in the background, and that's fine. We love that. But it also means that people don't get to see that we have been really holding back on approving vaccines that are even going to come to discussion at the ACIP meetings because of safety or efficacy issues, or both. And so by the time they come to the ACIP, all of the data, pertinent data is reviewed. Summaries are provided at the meetings. And as I said, sometimes these meetings can take 1 to 2 years. So meaning we can start with a vaccine product in, say, 2020, with a timeline to look at potentially a final vote by 2022 or 2023. So these are very highly deliberated processes that lead to a stepwise a process of understanding the product, who should receive it, who should not receive it, what are the safety profiles, what additional information do we need, and then finally a vote may be taken. Again, the public will see a vote taken that looks amazing. Everybody's usually in agreement, or there's some degree of dissension, which is fine. But that, again, is the culmination of usually years, if not decades, of work on that particular product. So I think it's really not appropriate to say that, this is a slam dunk kind of a rubber stamp. And that is unfortunate, because the process takes many years. For example, I was a liaison to the ACIP on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics for 4 years, from 2018 to 2022. And some of the vaccines that are coming forward now for review and vote, we were reviewing back in those days and even before, to understand what the proper utilization, if any, would be for some of these products.
So here's the irony. You've just described a process that is far more rigorous, because it not only requires FDA review, approval, licensing, which most drugs that we use for treating diseases, that's all it goes through. So vaccines go through that, and then goes on to the ACIP for even more rigorous review to talk about the clinical utility, the meaning, really look at the safety. So for vaccines, there's such an extra level of approval Yet, people like, and I'm just going to call him out, the director of Health and Human Services right now, Secretary, he has for years been saying vaccines are unsafe. They're not effective. They're not rigorous reviewed. There's, quote, no gold standard, which, based on your description right now, is ludicrous. That now they've come under attack, and it's magnified through social media to the point where all 17 members of the ACIP present a week ago have been unceremoniously dismissed, and the reason given was conflicts of interest, right? And I looked at the website, and they're published. I mean, the conflict of interest, at least a third had none, no conflict of interest. Some had been investigators for a trial, where the money for doing that trial goes to the individual's institution, and they use that money to conduct the trial. That's hardly a conflict. And a few people have been consultants to help guide the development through a company, and some have a few, one or two, I think, had ownership and small ownership in a company or two. I'm not sure I would be excited about approving that, but not much conflict of interest. So you were on the committee, you were unceremoniously dismissed. How did that feel?
Well, frankly, I wasn't surprised. I thought that there were a lot of signals early on in the beginning of the year that there would be, some degree of scrutiny of the committee, and that could lead to something like this. I guess I wasn't surprised. I guess I was shocked at, at the dismissal of the entire group. And we found out through a Wall Street Journal article. Nobody told us this. They chose to release it in a public forum. This administration tends to like to speak on tweets, and I don't use Twitter myself. I mean, my team does, and they let me know, but I'm too busy doing work to actually follow social media all day long. So we found out in the middle of other things that we were all out. And then we all got some letters later that day, very short. At least we were thanked, which is interesting because some other letters that have been received lately have not been very complimentary. I don't think that's the issue, though, about us individually. I mean, it's a lot of work. It's one less thing I have to do, but it's really important work, and we do it because we believe in public health and we believe in the safety of the American public, the U.S. public. And this is our area of expertise, all of us. There are many people besides us 17 who could do this important work. And it takes a lot of time and effort, but that's not the concern for me about us individually. The concern is for the process. This is a process that has been established, vetted, it works. We go through constant renewal and reflection and review of data around safety. Could the process be better? Yes, we have constantly asked for more support, for surveillance, for public health, and for vaccines in general, more specifically. But our public health systems, if anything, have lost more and more support, funding, and now staffing to do the kind of work that they know how to do well and better than anybody, I would say, in the world. And so I'm more concerned about the process and whether that process will continue in a rigorous and transparent way. And that's the concern.
So they've announced 8 replacements of the 17 who were dismissed. I've looked through that list. There's a couple people who I think uh, historically would have been appointed to this committee, perhaps, or maybe even served on it previously. I don't remember, but there's 6 or so who are well known to be um, antithetical to vaccines, or have claimed without scientific data about harm done by vaccines, based on, and have made a name for themselves in social media. So they are spending a lot of their time on Twitter and other places, unlike you. Um, First off, is 8 people enough? It sounds like this is a lot of work. And secondly, if you're comfortable, tell me your assessment of the replacements.
Well, we just saw those come out a couple days after, but let me just start with the process. What was the process? We know what the process was for us. Some of us took 2 years to get appointed to ACIP. We had to submit lots of paperwork, etc. So we don't know what the process was for hiring these people. Secondly, I do know about of or know some personally of these 8 people. I don't really want to talk about their particular stance because I don't know in the end what's going to happen when they attend the meeting and what they're going to do. I can only hope that they will uphold the same standards that previous ACIP committees have upheld. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But you just have to look at the kinds of papers they've published in the past to see that their views are, some of the views may be, I would say, outside of the mainstream. And that is something that this administration is celebrating. I think the secretary pretty much has stated that from the beginning. He wants to hear alternative views. And I think that's a good thing. We do need to hear alternative views, but they need to be based in facts and science and data that we can assess and read and understand, and to make sure that those data are properly analyzed. And I think that's an issue that some people may be concerned about when it comes to seeing some of these records. And the third thing is, I don't know what the proper number of people is. 8 seems a little tough. But what's really concerning on the short term is we have a meeting in 2 weeks. We were all ready for that meeting. We've been preparing for these meetings. As I said, we prepare weeks, months in advance. We know the history of what's going on with each of the antigen products. And I'm not sure that this group will know, especially since ACIP generally does have a 4-year term and they stagger those, so everybody doesn't leave at the same time. And now we've all been summarily dismissed, all of us, with a brand new crop of individuals who is, I think 1 or 2 may have already been on ACIP in the past. I know at least 1 has. But I don't know how well they've been keeping up with the literature on the vaccines that may be discussed at the upcoming meeting. And so certainly the transition is probably not going to be a very smooth one, to say the least.
So I think everybody listening can hear what you've said, and perhaps pass a little bit of judgment on whether there really was a need to change this, what I think is a pretty functional group, to a totally novice group, if you will, to take your place without the prep, the planning, the study that you guys have already put in. For example, for the meeting for 2 weeks from now, they won't have that opportunity. It's hard for me to say that the general public of the United States is better off for these changes. And when you add to it the dismissal of a lot of the staff that you alluded to earlier, I know the general public doesn't have any clue of what the quote bureaucrats, is what they would be called, do for us every day in terms of culling material, getting it to us, organizing the meetings, providing support when we need things to be done. I've not served on ACIP, but I've served on many other NIH and CDC committees, and I see what they do every day. And now their ranks are being decimated because of what I consider to be um, thoughtless, just slicing with a chainsaw of people's positions. I think if we look at FDA alone, Peter Marks, who we both know, is a stellar scientist who guided a lot of vaccines through the FDA, just unceremoniously got a 3 a.m. email that said, "You're dismissed. You can take a job in Alaska if you'd like, but otherwise you can resign." And that happened to lots of people at CDC, FDA, NIH. And I can't, for the life of me, see how this helps the country. You can comment if you'd like, but just your thoughts.
Yeah, Mike, I couldn't agree more. That's probably one of the most tragic pieces of information that we've seen over the last few months. And it's not just a personal thing, because you and I know these people very well. They're amazing people. I have always thought that the public health workforce gets very little credit, and they don't do the work for the credit. They do this for the US public. They do it for all of you out there to keep you all safe and and healthy, and to really denigrate and belittle the work that these people have been doing is really unfortunate. They are really our workhorses to keep this country safe and healthy. And to be dismissed summarily in such a demeaning fashion, like I said, at least my email, my 2-sentence email, at least said thank you. I don't think any of them were thanked. And the process has been incredibly haphazard. You and I have spoken to some of these high level people who've been let go, maybe not fired, but pulled out of their jobs and really given very poor choices on what else to do. Like you said, you can move to Alaska if you want to keep your job here. So really, this is the way the government purges. They don't fire you. They put you in a very untenable position where you have to walk away. And it's not only a travesty for these individuals, it is a travesty for the U.S. public health infrastructure. We are going to be less healthy because of this. And it may not show up today or tomorrow, but it will show up in the long term in terms of who we are, what our life expectancy is, what the diseases that we start to accumulate over time will look like.
Yeah, and I liken a lot of our colleagues in the public health sector have done the work for decades um, to being similar to the military. They don't put their lives on the line like a soldier would, so that's different. But what's similar is that they are making personal sacrifices to serve the U.S. public. They don't make as much money in many cases as they would in the private sector. A lot of them are physicians who could have gone into private practice and made a lot more money. They serve because they believe in the mission. They are not allowed, because of ethics rules, to take any excess funding. They aren't allowed to consult for industry. They're not allowed to do a lot of things that any other academic would be able to do. They have to divest themselves of all of that, and they're scrutinized heavily. And so they do this because they believe in the mission of public health. And without any acknowledgement of that, they've been dismissed, and I think we're all the poorer for it. Let's wrap up with, just as best you can, what you think from your perspective is going to happen in the next couple of years as we move forward, and based on what we've seen the last 6 months.
It's hard to come up with a optimistic scenario, but I am a born optimist, and I do believe in the intelligence of the American public. I think social media has taken people down terrible rabbit holes, but I think in the end, what I see as a former ACIP member, and when I was an ACIP, we get a lot of correspondence from people who are absolutely committed to vaccines. And you can see that when you look at data, most children in this country, the vast majority of children, 90% plus, have received all or most of their vaccines. We know that people follow federal guidelines on public health guidelines around health issues. So we know that the majority of the US public does believe in these things. And I can only hope that they stand up and demand to be protected the way that they were in the past. And I just think that there are a lot of people out there, but you do hear, as we heard in the past from people who were very vehemently anti-vaccine, there's a very small group of very vocal and very influential people who claim to represent the majority of the US. And I'm just hoping that that is not true. It hasn't been true in the past. So I still see a lot of people out there who do believe in the things that in science and public health and data, and the things that you and I stand for in terms of protecting people's health. And I hope that they understand and are vigilant about these processes and demand the best that they can from their government.
And I'm pretty sure everybody listening, or most everybody, agrees fully with your sentiment. Bonnie, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a wonderful discussion, and let's hope for the best for the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, we have to keep doing the work. We can't stop.
Amen. Thank you for listening to this episode of Going Antiviral. Catch up on earlier episodes wherever you listen to podcasts, And check out the video versions of this episode and others on the IAS-USA YouTube channel. You can find these links in the show notes, or simply go to YouTube and search for IAS-USA, and there they are. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review Going Antiviral on Apple Podcasts. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as medical advice. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the IAS-USA or its affiliate, and do not necessarily represent the viewpoints of their employers. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, you can send it to podcast@iasusa.org to be answered in a future episode.